on mute. I was trying to cut out some background noise, and
No, no
I was
problem.
talking, and it wasn't going anywhere.
No problem. I do the same thing at least once a day. Okay, so the long and the short of it is in terms of making modifications, if there's something that needs to be changed on the output names, that would be under the columns here. So you would have to manually change one of these column names here. If it was something like adding a brand new column, you can certainly add the column here, but then that becomes also that you would need to add the column in the target table and things like that. So that gets a little bit more complicated if you're including fields that weren't previously included. The majority of the changes otherwise are going to occur in the SQL. So right now, what the bridge does is it goes, thank you. It goes to, it's checking the existing records in that table, then it's executing the stored procedure, and then it's actually basically populating the output file based on that table. So at this point in time, the table in EMAS is a one-to-one mapping to the output file. And that just kind of makes it easy to visualize and go through that way. But if we look here, this is the thing that's really responsible for the guts and the processing of the bridge itself.
Okay.
So the first thing that happens is it's got the country mapping table that's defined in the script. Now, if you run the script again, it's not going to recreate that table because it assumes that you may have manually entered some things in here, right? So right now there's a bunch of items that have missing translations. They'll need to get updated by you at some point in time, so that, for example, the Aruba, so that the colleague code matches the EMAS code. So it won't recreate the tables unless you specifically do anything. You can see here there's also a lookup table for the suffix mapping. Same thing there. It'll need to be maintained. Same thing with the, there is the race mapping, but I think actually we're manually doing some mapping a little bit here later on. But you can see here that it's creating a EMAS to colleague dem table in the database, and that's what's used by the bridge to basically manipulate those records, and then the DTSS package is the one that's actually grabbing that data and putting it into the output file. So you can see here that we do some, there's also the history table, which is the one that records which records have been exported. And then you can see that this is the store procedure that gets invoked at the start of it. So it's going to go through and basically say it's going to generate a new batch so that we're recording each extract as its own batch, and it has an associated ID with it. It goes through and inserts an initial select, right? So we've got our actual criteria for which students get selected is during the initial batch, right? So right now we're only doing specific stages, cancel date is null, admit code is not denied kind of thing. So if that ever needed to change, that's where it's changed, is right there. Then we do our initial select based on that initial set. So this is the point where if you had something where, for example, like the alt ID, right now that's hard coded into the stored procedure. If that needed to change to be somehow dynamic, or if it just straight up needed to be changed, it would need to be changed in the script here, and then the script run against the SQL Server again to basically update that stored procedure so it now uses some of these. So some of these guys are hard-coded values in some of the translations and some of the defaults. So like, for example, the prefix, you can see that there's, what's the other one here? The ethnic, gender, some of those guys are all hard-coded. So if they were to change in coding sets, either in EMAS or in colleague, they would have to be updated. Same thing here, it kind of goes through, does all the addresses, and then you can see by the comments here, some of these items are divided out into their own sets of updates just because of the sort of the complexity of the initial query. Sometimes it's easier to break them out into little concepts rather than trying to chunk them all into one giant nasty update. But it goes through and does all of the phones. Then it goes through and does the race mapping, the country mapping, and then basically that's the end of the stored procedure. So if there was additional processing that needed to happen. So let's say at some point in time you guys wanted to also verify, I don't know, like the market segment or something like that, or maybe manually manipulate some additional values. You could just add on at the end of the stored procedure some additional lines here to manipulate or work with the table, look up other data, whatever else, and then run that script again. And that would automatically start running that stored procedure with the bridge. So the idea with this is the vast majority of changes that you would need to make in the future can be done in SQL without having to redeploy the DTSX package. The only reason you need to redeploy the DTSX package is if there's basically mapping changes.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So we could a change like that, which would just be that a single value.
Mm-hmm.
We could do that on the server then.
Yeah. Basically, exactly. So you always want to make sure. The only thing I would say is that you want to make sure that your source, so like this stuff here, matches what you've got on the server. So if you make an update, just make sure you make them in both places so that you're tracking. Because otherwise, if you go to the server and just manually edit the stored procedure in the server, then you got the opportunity that if somebody else comes in and makes a change here and then redeploys, it's going to wipe out your changes. So just from a purpose point of view, that it's always better to make the change and then execute it so that you have the same source everywhere. But certainly, if there was changes made to the stored procedure and you wanted to replicate those somewhere else, you could generate a script for the stored procedure and then replace the one in the script. But yeah, that's basically just good practice is all it is.
Okay. So let's see, we need to get this guy.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm. The other thing to note is the other way of deploying it. There's some additional things that can be done with the bridge in terms of programming that would take a little bit more time, but would make it much more dynamic in terms of what happens when you run it. So, and that's where the IPAC files kind of come into play. So there's some things you can do where you can dynamically parameterize some elements of it, and then every time you deploy, you can either run with those additional parameters or not. It's a little bit more complicated to do that. The reason you might do that is if you had a single package that was installed somewhere. But like, for example, if you had test and production on the same machine and you wanted to deploy a single package and then dynamically configure within the package as to whether or not it's running against the test database or the production databases, that might be a reason to do it. Or if you had something where, for example, if you needed to parameterize a bridge so that it only ran for a certain market segment or something like that, that might be another reason why you would go and parameterize the bridge. But for what you guys are doing right now, made the decision to not involve that additional work and kind of keep it as focused as possible, which is that we have a single package, it runs, it does its bridging and everything else on the single server, which seems like the best metric for you guys because you have you have a server per environment. Alrighty, let's go back down here and let's take a look. There we go. And what we're going to do is we're going to change this and we're going to say rely on SQL Server for roles and access controls. So by default, the DTSX package, if you specify any passwords or accounts or things like that, it comes in and it basically creates its own authentication key. And in order to use that authentication key, you kind of have to share between the development machine and the SQL Server machine, and it can get a little bit complicated. What we're doing in this scenario is saying rely on the SQL Server. So what that's basically saying is that this package is going to run as the user that's executing it on the server, rather than some encrypted values or whatever else that might have been been stored in the DTSX file. So for us, that's fine. Because we're actually running that as the what's it called, SQL Server Agent user, and we set up those permissions the last time we were there. So now if we refresh, we should see that we have a new package in here. So the package itself, you can manually run the package, but at that point you're running as yourself and everything else. The best way to do it is, let's just go ahead and connect to the database engine, and we'll run it as a job, kind of the same way it's going to be set up and automated. And do we need to log in, or will it let you in? No, it's going to let you in. All right. So SQL Server Agent, we are going to create a new job. And it's always good to have some consistency. So we're going to name the job the same thing. And we are going to run a new step. And our step is to run a SQL Server Integration Services package. We're running as the SQL Server Agent. So if something changed and you guys wanted to lock down the SQL Server Agent, or you wanted to change the permissions that it had or whatever else, what that would involve is coming through and creating either a new proxy or sometimes an associated credential. And then you would have another item that shows up in the run as. But for now, we've got the SQL Server Agent. And we should be able to, let's see here. Or if it's going to find anything. Come on. We're going against the SQL Server. And the SQL Server. And we've got our package here. And sometimes if you've got additional configuration or other things, they can be exposed here. You can also manually manipulate some of the entries. In this case, the ones that we already set up should be good to go. And that's fine. That's fine. And we can use the default logging. Let's see. No, we don't want to do that. Actually, let's remove you and just rely on SQL Server logging. That should be fine. Run SSIS. Alrighty, so we're going to leave the rest of this alone for now, but let's go ahead and do that. So what I'd like to do is manually execute that job. Have you run this package against the server? Do we need to reset the history table or anything like that?
No. Okay. No, I've not done anything, so.
Okay, so let's just take a look here. Yeah. Trying to remember what the name of it is there. Okay, it's history, right? EMAS 2. Why aren't you finding anything? That's weird.
Have we put those tables in production yet?
Well, now it makes me wonder if we've actually run that script against production. Doesn't look like it, does it? All right, well, let's do that then. First things first. Alrighty, let's go back to here. And is that where it was?
That's the network. You looking for the local?
Yeah, I was looking for the one where we had that script on
let's see.
There it is, the dim. Actually, you know what would be a good idea? Since right now we're using this guy as our sort of system of record, I'm going to propose removing these old entries. Is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm.
And that'll be a little bit more clean. All right. And since we've made modifications, I'm going to delete you. And so right now we've got our SQL.
Sorry, it opened on another screen.
And there we go. And we're going to copy.
I'm not sure that, well, it might. Let's see.
Oh, it might not work. We'll find out here. Nope. All right.
Yeah,
so I
that's
guess we'll
one
have
of
to
the
copy the SQL over then.
frustrating things. Okay, here we are.
So is this something we should have done earlier?
To be honest, I thought we did it in the earlier call, but I think I was mistaken on that. So.
Okay. I just making sure it wasn't something we were supposed to have already done.
No, it's fine. This
Maybe we didn't know about, or that I didn't know about.
No, this was all part of the installation itself.
Okay, so if we go back here, and all right, so now if we
Perfect. Alrighty. Let's try this out. Alrighty. So that's set up. And now, when we go and we look at our tables here, let's give it a refresh. There we go. All right. So we should be good to go at this point because our history table will be empty. And we can manually execute that job. So let's try that out. Now, if it dumps right away here, typically that means that we've got some sort of a permissions error or something like that. Like maybe it's trying to access a table it doesn't have access to, or it's trying to write to a file it doesn't have access to. But that says clean. Let's just take a look at our history here. And we'll take a look at the details on that. I don't know why they always make this screen so small. Let's try it. No, that didn't really help either. All right. Well, we'll scroll down, see what we see here. Return success, so that's good. Let's go take a look. And at this point, we should have an output file. And we've got a few records in there. So that's 4 records in there. And then let's take a look at our history table. Of course, IntelliType won't work now.
I think you're in the EMAS Online.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. I think that's it, or maybe there's an underscore. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so that matches there. We've got our batch date, we've got complete, and then the other thing we're going to want to try is we're going to execute this guy and see what happens, because we want to know that everything is okay if we run it and there's no records to include. So we've got nothing there, and it did generate a file, but it's empty.
Okay.
So
let's take a look at the first file again, because it looks like, let's see, first 3 of those are bogus. Those, I mean, it worked right. It's just those are
okay. Those are test records.
Those are test ones.
Right.
We do still have, or they do testing in production. But it looks like Fortner is correct. So, we want to run through that?
Yeah, if you wanted to try and import, that's fine with me. The other thing that I wanted to check before we did that is, or just to kind of while we're on the screen, is so right now, anytime you want to run the bridge, you can go in and right click and say start job at step. Okay. But ultimately what you'll probably want to do is to go into the job properties and do a couple of things. So there's a bunch of different things you can do on the jobs. The things that I would recommend is to set up, and this might require a little research on your side, but basically in SQL Server you can set up an SMTP connection so that the SQL Server is able to authenticate and send messages when something happens. And what you'd want to do is set that up. Right now it's not available, but once you set it up and configure basically a notification entry, you can set up an operator with an associated email, and then you can say email me when the job fails, so that if, for example, that maybe everything's running fine and just suddenly out of the blue something happens like bad records or whatever else, you'll get an email as soon as that happens. And it's always nicer to have a notification instead of an angry user saying where's my import files, or my import files are bad, what's going on here. So that's one thing I would recommend setting up, is the notifications. There is also the alerts. The alerts are more like, if the job runs too long, or if, it's more of a kind of like warning type system. I find that the notifications, usually if something if there's something wrong with a bridge job or a package or whatever else, you're going to get it as a failure. And so the email's enough for that. But the other item, of course, is the schedule. So you'd create a new schedule. What kind of schedule, reoccurring, days, whatever else. And then that would automatically run the job, and it's going to output files in that directory every time it does. And actually, the one thing I would recommend, since this is a shared, this is going to become a share. We didn't set it up as a share, but this is going to be your share folder. I'm going to create a new folder here, and we'll just call this the same thing, which is the EMAS to and we'll put our source files in there. So these are the files that we use to set it up on the server, and that way that folder, that bridge folder, when you share it out, the users, all they're going to see is the available exports, or the available imports rather.
Okay.
That's good for them.
Good idea.
The other thing that you can do in terms of steps, you can also add additional steps. So you could add, and this also goes into notifications or something like that. But if there was some other thing that you wanted to kick off or initiate after the bridge is run, that would be another area where you can do all kinds of stuff in here. But that's kind of the overview. Did you have any questions about kind of how to set it up afterwards?
Well, I have never configured SQL Server to be able to send email.
Okay. I can send you a knowledge base article on that. It's relatively simple. The only thing that you need to be aware of is, or the only sort of gotcha that typically happens with those kinds of things, is that frequently most like Exchange configurations, or I don't know if you guys use G Suite or any of those ones, you're only able to send as a particular email. So sometimes the easiest way to do that is to create, I don't know if you guys have like a no reply type account that you could set up for that, but sometimes it's easier to create an account as a no reply or some other notification account, so that you can send as that particular user, and then it's only a notification SMTP account. So that's the only real gotcha on that, is that because sometimes if you just set it up as like your credentials, but you're trying to send as like a generic email address or some other email address on campus, the SMTP servers will reject the messages.
Okay. Well, Denise is our Exchange admin, so
okay, there we go.
She's the right person to
probably preach into the choir then.
Yeah, she's the right person to be on this call.
All right. Got my orders.
So yeah, basically there's two things that have to get set up, and I'll send you a knowledge base article on it. But basically, the one is the actual the SMTP, and then once that's set up, then you have what are called operators. And so the operators are the ones, and it's basically a person. So you're setting it up. You might have Travis or a bridge operator, whatever that is, and then you're associating the email address with them. You know, you can do all sorts of stuff like who's on pager duty and all that kind of stuff. But generally, you know, what we've done in our instances is we set up either an email group or something like that, and then we just fire the notifications to the group. And so basically, this is the creation of the operator, so that when you go through and you set up the actual notification, if something happens, you know, good or bad, you can set it up. This is who will be populated in the drop down here. Is the notification target is one of the operators.
All right, cool.
And usually, you know, once these things are set up and you kind of run through an initial set of records, usually they're kind of bulletproof going forward. The only time you would typically see, especially since everything that's happening here is table driven, usually the only things, and SQL's not going to allow you to really get, you know, things like field overflows or things like that, because it's already defined and set up that way so that it's trimming all those. But sometimes the only things that can happen is, you know, maybe you get like weird codes or character sets that don't match, or unescaped character sequences or things like that. Those are generally the kinds of things that would kind of sort of trigger an error. But yeah. And just a reminder on that, the way that the bridge is configured is that if it runs into an error during the bridge processing, what'll happen is it won't, so the normal mechanisms or the normal workflow for the bridge is basically that it goes through and checks to see if there's records that exist in the export table. And if there is records that exist in the export table, it's going to drop, it's not going to run. Because what happens at the end of a successful run is that it basically clears that table. And so the workflow is that if something happens, you know, some bad data or something craps out or whatever else, it stops and it will hold that data in the table so that it's there for analysis, basically.
Okay, so the new tables then, or the
yeah, so it would hold it in the EMAS dem table. But normally when you run the bridge, it should be basically clearing that out on a successful run. Yeah, I don't know why it won't let me. It won't let you expand. I figured that might have been something with GoToMeeting on my side, but it looks like it's still being fussy for you too. But yeah, you can try scrolling over on the bottom. Maybe that might work a little bit. But yeah, basically there's the mapping tables, right? So there's those three mapping tables. The dem table is the one where basically the records are loaded to, and then they're loaded from there into the physical output file. And then the dem history is the one that basically keeps track of which student IDs were exported as part of which batch file. So if there's any other reason to come back in there, you would have a record of, oh, this student was exported as part of this batch. Okay. And so that they're not exported multiple times.
So it successful, it clears us out.
Correct.
If I remember. Yep. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and so ideally, if we could get ICE to cooperate with us, we could set something up to automatically move.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you can do there. You can, you can even modify the SSIS package so that it run, or what you could even do is have SQL run some sort of BAP file or whatever else after the bridge runs to manually move that somewhere else, or that could be part of the SSIS to manually move that somewhere else. But at that point, whatever process is there would need to know or have access to either a share or some sort of a FTP or something like that to be able to upload that file somewhere.
Well, the way our network connects to them, there's only one machine on our network that can actually connect to them directly. So probably we would still keep it on the bridge, but move it from there to what is it? Our domain controller.
Mm-hmm.
So graphics. EMAS 2. And there's one record. Let's see. Okay, so now we'll go ITCI. It's core. Oh, I just realized y'all can't see what I'm doing. Sorry. And yeah, so no ambiguities. So it recognized that the kid is actually in there, but it knows. So now the next step then is, what do we need to get the or ERP ID back to colleague? With a simple, because I can actually create, most of our reporting is done on an ODS, which is a day old, but for some reporting, I can hit the transactional to pull stuff out. So I could do,
yeah, basically in terms of, there's a couple different options there. What I would typically do is something that, as long as you can generate some sort of a flat file that basically contains a list of records, and pretty much all you need is, I don't know, it doesn't really matter what additional information is in the file, but basically what you're looking for is something that has the EMAS ID and the colleague ID. And as long as you have those two values in a flat file, then what you can do is set up a very simple SQL Server Integration Services package that would basically grab the contents of that file. And then what I would typically do is create a custom table in the database, dump the results of that or update the results in that table, and then kick off another SQL procedure to basically go through and look and say, hey, if there's any records in EMAS that don't have, I believe you guys are using student number, the student number field in each student. So basically go through and look and say, hey, if there's any results from this, selection set that don't have student number populated, then, populate them with the corresponding match. So it's a relatively easy set of things to do. It's just a matter of getting the report or the file or whatever it is in a place where the SQL Server can automatically consume it. And you could set it up so that it runs that, hourly or whatever else, depending on what your options are from generating it from colleague. But in terms of what the bridge would need to do, in terms of pushing that ID from colleague back into EMAS, it just needs to know, hey, where do I get my file, and then update the data. So it could run, basically as soon as it has files.
That's going to be pretty much the top 1,000 anyway. Oh, I know the ones have that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to save this for posterity. This is our first bridge.
Frame it. All right. Cool. Well, yeah. So, assuming you guys want us to still work on that second phase of that, then Travis, what I need from you in terms of moving forward is some sort of a flat file. So, if you can generate some sort of a flat file, CSV, tab delimited, whatever, but some sort of a flat file that is accessible to the SQL Server, or we can build some sort of an automation package that gets it there. But basically some sort of an automatically generated flat file that contains a colleague ID and the alt ID, the EMAS alt ID. And then as soon as we have those data points, then the rest is just a matter of building up the package to automatically update any missing records on that.
Okay. I'm not that familiar with EMAS imports. Can imports update, or are they only inserts?
Sorry, I just realized I'm on mute. So they can update. As soon as they go through and do an update, at that point, it's dependent on the basically the dominant settings as to what actually happens, right? So whether or not, and it's a field by field. You can have a bunch of different settings in there, but basically it's a field by field dominance to say, is the import dominant or is the existing EMAS data dominant, and if there's a conflict between those. But in this particular case, since all we're doing is updating the student number, I personally would skip the whole EMAS import mechanism itself and just directly update the records in the table, because there's no, normally the criteria for indicating whether or not you should use the import facility in EMAS is whether or not there's something that might change in the business logic sequencing. So for example, it's totally fine to update something like an ID number or a value or specific things that wouldn't change, for example, which communication a student gets. The stage change or decision change or anything like that. So basically anything that might trigger any of the plan managers in EMAS to run. So that would be like score calculations, mailings, any mailings, automated mailings, any track sets that they might be part of, anything where it might change the business logic, then that's something that you want to push through the import facility. But in the case of this, it's highly unlikely that unless you have some very strange user exit or something like that going on, there's no business logic that gets triggered when somebody's ID gets updated like that.
Okay. All right. Well, I will find out, because I know that is, but we are at the point where anything you all do is would be new contract or new billing.
No, I think it's, as far as I'm aware, and maybe that's a question for your finance folks, but as far as I'm aware, we still have an existing time and materials contract. So basically anything that's happening with bridge work just gets billed. I don't know if it's weekly or bi-monthly or what the scenario is. But at that point, it's just hours. So we're time and materials. The only thing that is, I think we still have 1 or 2 hours left from the original contract, which is for specifications. So, for
Okay.
example, any work that occurs, if you were to give me a new format, a new file, any work that I do to produce specifications for, this goes where or whatever else, that's already covered by the existing item. But the programming and the implementation and any normal support is fine, but any sort of support escalations beyond that are the time and materials.
Okay. Because ideally, well, I'll talk to Blair about that just to make sure. But ideally, what I was planning was to do the report to get that, but then for the ERP ID to get pushed back to the student number in each student,
Mm-hmm.
that would sort of be the final part of this.
Yeah.
But I want to be sure about that before.
No, definitely. And
what I have to.
The other conversations that occurred as part of all that was some of the initial estimations and complexity and everything else. These two, obviously the one that we've completed now, I'm pretty sure, I'd have to double check the hours, but I'm pretty sure even with the implementation client time and testing time and back and forth and everything else included, we're under our initial estimate of what that would be. And the next phase of that was also a fairly small time chunk in terms of overall hours. So, for example, the pushing of the IDs or updating the IDs, assuming we can get a flat file, is nowhere near the level of complexity that this bridge was.
So when you say flat file, CSV, would that be fine?
CSV, text file.
Or do you need like a PRN?
Nah, CSV is perfect.
Okay. As long as it doesn't drop the leading zeros.
Well, even the leading zeros is okay because we still have the opportunity to manually pad those or insert them. So leading zeros is fine. It's more of an issue of, depending on how you end up outputting your flat file, if there's other columns that have to be included in there, and I'm just hypothetically, if you can't decide which columns get outputted and some of them get included that have comma values in them, then that would break the CSV format, and then it might be, then either you're doing, like an additional level of, like you're wrapping everything in quotes with the comma, or you're using another format where you don't have to worry about conflicts with the breaking the format, basically like that. But there's no, from my side, there's no functional requirements to say, oh, only CSV will work or only pipe will work or whatever that. It's kind of whatever is available.
But so just a 2-column file would be ERP ID and the EMAS?
Yeah,
or
basically.
Vice versa. Just
as
long as they're consistently in the same order.
Exactly. As long as they're consistent, that's fine. The only other thing that you might want to add in or think about is, and I don't know that this would make sense or not, but just throwing it out there, the only other thing that maybe you want to include somewhere else in the table is the date. But we kind of already have the date from when they were exported from EMAS. I just don't know if there might be a reason why we wanted to keep track of the date that they were, I don't know, some sort of a date that they were brought back in. Would be the only other thing that if you ever had any need for tracking as to when somebody moved back and forth between the systems, that date might be helpful in that custom table. But even then, I'm just taking guesses. The only mandatory items are the 2 IDs.
All right. Okay. Does date format matter? Year, month, day, month, year?
No. As long as it's consistent, it's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, I can handle. I mean that shouldn't take long to do, and I will confirm with Blair about that. And obviously, what I'm sure Melissa and Robin would like would be to move on to phase 2, which would be the application.
Mm-hmm.
That'll require other people saying yes.
Right.
Yep. But no, I mean, they're looking forward to this, so I think we're going to save them quite a bit of double keying, at least on the name and address and that stuff.
Exactly. The initial record creation is definitely going to be helpful.
All right. Well, so I guess we're I guess that's it.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. So I sent you the article on the email notification, and then when you guys feel comfortable enough with the bridge itself and not running that manually, then you just have to modify the schedule on it to set it up for, whatever that is, once a day or, every 4 hours or only, I don't know, whatever it ends up looking like.
All right. All right.
If your users are relatively savvy, you can also set it up that they have the ability to manually invoke the package themselves too.
Nah.
Automatic.
Nah, we'll give them access to the directory, but
right.
not. All right. Well, Denise, did you have any questions?
I don't think so. I don't think he sent me the email, but as long as you send it to Travis, that's fine. The email.
I'll forward it to you.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, it should be okay. The only thing that I think you'll need is basically just the standard SMTP connection information, like the server, login, password, okay. And then if there's any, whatever, everybody has their own sort of combination of security. So like 587 or, which port are you using, which, is it TLS, yeah. Okay. Yada, 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 that kind of stuff.
Okay, sounds good.
Travis, the only other thing that I would say that might be a good discussion point from your workflow side of it is how the users are going to agree or indicate which bridge files have been imported. Normally, for that, people handle it a couple different ways. They either have an additional folder, like an imported folder, and when they're done importing the file, they move that file into the imported folder, or they just delete the file, or they rename it, or there's some sort of a indication to say, and I don't know, and this is mostly important if there could be multiple people importing, you just want to have some way of indicating, hey, this is already done, don't re-import it.
Okay, so it's going to deliver the file to C bridge. Any problem with just creating some subfolders for imported or?
No, okay. You can create anything you want. The bridge is just going to write files into this directory in the same format. So the only thing that would interact or break with the bridge is if you, for example, deleted or renamed this folder. Then it would get cranky about that because it can't get the bridge folder.
All right. Yeah, I think that's actually a good idea. It's just to have another that says imported or done or something instead of deleting it.
Right. Yeah, it's usually helpful to hang on to the files for a while just in case there's something that you wanted to review.
All right. Well, we will do that.
All righty. Well, thank you both. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
No, thanks. I told Robin I'd have good news for today, probably at 3, and we're right at that. So
right on time.
You're 5 minutes early.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you very much.
Very good. Travis, what I'm going to do is the recording for today and the recording that we did the other day. The recording that we did the other day isn't that important, but it does show that the permission changes that we made to the SQL agent and some things like that. I'm going to compile those up, and I'll have them put them up on the EMAS portal as well. So they're there for reference if you need them.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
All right. Well, have a good afternoon.
You do the same, Chris. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank
See y'all.
Bye. All right. Bye-bye.